Dorling's latest book, The Next Crisis, a brilliant book that examines what we think about the future. Over the next hour, we're going to consider the role of the mainstream economist in the crisis we face today. To put this in form of a question, if we all have these crises, what role has mainstream economics had in measuring, understanding, reacting, and maybe even causing those crises? To many viewers, the idea that we will question the economist's role in a multiple crisis might seem peculiar. All they do is give advice, as unbiased as it can be, to policymakers. They base their opinions on mathematical models and iron economic laws. Perhaps things should be different, but alas, one cannot argue with the mathematics or the law of supply and demand. But this is not two guys going off on one on a podcast. Many economists, even within the mainstream itself, are questioning the role of mainstream economists in today's crisis. Czech economist Thomas Sedlacek states in his book Economics of Good and Evil that mainstream economists have forsaken too many colours of economics and have been over-obsessed with the black and white cult of Homo economicus, which ignores issues of good and evil. He adds, we have created a self-inflicted blindness to the most important driving forces of human actions, and this has led to the evolution of lopsided, artificial models that are often of little use when it comes to understanding reality. The economics profession is culpable in the contemporary backlash against democratic governance, civic obligation, and racial and other forms of equality. The profession shares responsibility for the erosion of solidarity and empathy that marks contemporary politics in too many societies. Angus Deaton, a winner of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, said in 2024 that economists who have prospered mightily over the past half-century might fairly be accused of having a vested interest in capitalism as it currently operates. Our emphasis, he says, on the virtues of free, competitive markets and exogenous technical change can distract us from the importance of power in setting, for example, prices and wages. The accusations of the negative impact of mainstream economists, of course, come much more strongly from within the heterodox schools of economics. Clara Matti blames mainstream economists directly for fascism in 1930s Italy, and Danny and I for the 300,000 UK deaths linked to austerity policies in the UK in the 2010s. Now, Professor Steve Keen places the lack of a fit and proper response to the ecological crisis squarely at the door of the middle-aged, white, wealthy mainstream economists. By questioning mainstream economics and maybe even occasionally individual mainstream economists, I hope that Danny and I can add even further colour and depth to his brilliant book. When we understand the framework policymakers use to address the crisis, we are empowered to seek an alternative. So that's my introduction. Let's get stuck into your latest book. Can you tell us a little bit about the book, The Next Crisis, and what you hope to achieve in writing this one?
The Next Crisis was written because we were in a period of people saying that we're in a polycrisis and things are terrible. And I wanted to have a look back and see for how long have we been actually saying this. It really began in the 1960s, and then we talked about crises more in the 70s, more in the 80s, more in the 90s. So it's been a long time. We've had 50 years of rising crises. And I also wanted to have a look at how different people around the world ranked the various crises and which ones are more important and which are less, to try to stop us just panicking about everything.
You group the crisis, that, definitely not Apollo's crisis, but lots of crises. You group them into 6 areas. So we've got cost of living, then you had sharing the work, war and the home, cradle to grave, the climate, and finally the biodiversity crisis. Now, what we're going to do is try and kind of investigate the economic framework behind those crises and the role of economics. But we have to start by saying you used your own kind of judgment here, haven't you, to kind of group all of those crises together. Can you briefly explain how you arrived at those 6 areas and kind of their order of importance?
Yes, I looked at various ways in which people try to produce lists of crises. There are actually people employed by businesses, so there are chief risks officers, and they quite usefully produce predictions every year at Davos, and we're speaking while Davos is meeting, or while they're meeting at Davos. And usually their predictions are wrong, which is interesting. But I didn't use their predictions. What I used were international surveys, particularly by Ipsos, but also by the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, of what people say the biggest concerns are in their country each month. And I looked at those. Because there were about 18, that's too many, and quite a lot are not mentioned that often, I took the ones that are mentioned the most. Above all else was cost of living and poverty and inequality. And I try to amalgamate them because, again, too many things to talk about, but also the cost of living and poverty and inequality are so closely connected. So that was the first crisis. It's getting by. People around the world, and often the middle class of the world, talk about the thing that worries them most is either how they get by or how other people are going to get by. And they have done for about a decade, and then it was second. The second one was unemployment. It was shocking to find out how high unemployment as a fear is around the world. Even in countries with quite low unemployment rates, people are very worried about not getting a job or losing their job. And I put immigration in with that because often concerns about immigration are worries about these people are going to come and take our jobs, and that isn't true, but it seemed useful to take the relatively small concerns there were about immigration around the world and put those in with employment. And then violence. It's to make sense to link all the things associated with violence and fear and war and terrorism together. Most of those fears are actually about very local violence, about robbery and burglary, which people worry about, even though they tend not to be that common. And then state services in general are quite a high concern. How's the health service going to cope? How's the schools coping at the housing crisis? And almost always involving the state or the state failing. And only then, and only by amalgamating all these other ones, could I actually get climate up to number 5 as a worry, because most people around the world are not that worried about the climate crisis, and their concern is falling over time. And lastly, I stuck biodiversity in because it's asked in the survey, and it's kind of separate because it's a very long-term crisis. As you see increasing numbers of species going extinct, it's something that cannot be reversed.
Kind of alluded to it there. Is this mainly a response for the kind of middle classes of the wealthier countries? Because you speak about, I think you called it elite projection within these surveys, and that how does that affect the crisis that you looked at?
Yeah, middle class people are much more likely to complete these surveys than poorer people. So there's an automatic bias in the survey. So the survey operators try to weight things to steer against that, but they can only do that to a certain extent. And the 30 countries included in the world, although there are countries in South America and Africa, but the 30 are pretty affluent countries. They're the most affluent countries in most continents. So although these are often presented as the views of average people, they're actually much more the views of middle class people. The middle class
in wealthier countries.
In wealthy countries, although the middle class in wealthy countries are not generally that well off, because inequality is so high that the best off 10% of people, which is a minority of, well, it's the middle class and the upper class. We kind of pretend the upper class doesn't exist anymore, but it's pointless calling it a class middle if there's something above it. The fact that things like cost of living so affect people who are doing better than average kind of shows you the concern. There are other surveys as well. I cover them in the book. There are surveys of university students across Europe. University students tend to be more affluent. They worry more about things like the climate, and less so about things like cost of living. But of course, almost all of them are not parents, so they don't have to worry about feeding children.
Yeah. Well, it was good to see there was a broad spread, but not as broad as we would hope, to have a clearer idea of what things were worrying most people in most countries. So before we dive headlong into the kind of role of mainstream economists in these crises, I thought it would be worth us kind of chatting or having a think about a kind of a definition of crisis. I know you don't like polycrisis, but here are a couple of things for us to consider. Are all of those things really a crisis? Does the overuse of the term crisis simply downplay a real crisis? If everything is a crisis, then nothing's a crisis. And also, what about this concept of a pseudo-crisis, which is a crisis that's artificially created by either a government or an external body?
I mean, there's a lot of trying to get people to worry about something other than the things that they should perhaps worry about. I think the classic would be, in the UK, say the trans debate. it's rather like throwing a dead cat on the table. It's a constant way to get left-wing people not to talk about things that really fundamentally matter to 99% of people, because in these surveys, issues of sexual identity just don't feature. So there are created crises. Talking about immigration as a problem rather than an advantage is a created crisis. We've altered the meaning of the word crisis. I think we have to accept it is not what it was once defined as, which is a short-term, shocking thing to occur, like a bombing raid from another country. Right? That we have to accept the word has changed to mean something we don't like, which isn't going away, and that's very different from the original meaning of the word crisis.
Yeah, and I suppose a lot of people think of a crisis being something that's generated by a specific event. There's something happened, it created a crisis. We can react to that crisis, and we know that we've solved that crisis when we've got rid of the problem that was created by the event. But what you're saying is that doesn't really encompass this very different world that we've got. And
yeah, one of the nicest ways of looking at it is if you just look at the BBC News website. At the top of the BBC News website, there's now a series of banners for things like Gaza-Israel war, climate crisis. I've forgotten them all, but they're there permanently now, and they were not there 2 or 3 years ago. And
yeah, very interesting. And when I looked at all of this, I really thought, are these crises of knowledge? Do we not know how to solve them, or are they crises that relate to power? And I think let's ignore the role of economists and economics at the moment, but we know how to solve all these crises. Wouldn't you agree? It's that people are choosing not to. Perhaps the people who are in positions of power are choosing not to do what they should do.
In many ways, most of these are things that we've had for at least a couple of 100 years. In the case of unemployment, slightly less. We didn't used to recognize unemployment before the 1880s, 1870s as a thing. But they're mainly relatively recent. You could say that poverty has always been with us, but there's been times when it's been much lower and times when it's been much higher, and it varies between places. So if you like, these are all aspects of our current life that we increasingly do not like. and the fact that we define them more and more as a crisis and a problem is possibly a very good thing, because it says we're not happy with the fact that people cannot be well housed, and we expect that to be possible.
Do you think that when we call everything a crisis, it does detract from things that are genuinely a crisis, or something that needs much more immediate attention?
I'm not sure. Ideally, you wouldn't have many things requiring immediate attention, because most of the bad things that happen in the world to people are generated by other people, including things that we often think of as natural. So famines are almost always because governments have allowed people to profiteer over food. It's not because a harvest has failed, and that's been going on for some time. The number of actual severe out of the blue crises are pretty low. I mean, you could take something like a pandemic, but pandemics have been reducing in their frequency over time. They're rarer and rarer. We've just gone through one, but it shouldn't come as a huge shock to us when we get another respiratory virus again. It isn't. We have more people doing more research and more knowledge in the world now than we've had in the whole of human history put together. The idea that we're constantly shocked by new things, I think, says more about our society. Another example would be AI. We've had artificial intelligence since the 1960s. It has ramped up. There were neural networks in the 1980s when I was a research student. My supervisor was building them in the 1980s. So that there's a temptation to say that we're being bombarded by new things. And I suspect that temptation is high amongst those who think fundamentally the way the world works is okay, but let's just keep the news fed with latest worries. And often the implication is, and we should let our betters worry about looking after us when these things come along.
Yeah, and certainly, and what we're going to discuss next is the idea that it's the economists that are the betters, and that we defer to their judgment and their views. So, what I want to do is I want to concentrate on, I suppose, what we'll call the mainstream or orthodoxy when we talk about economics and economists and the role in the crisis. The mainstream, now commonly referred to as neoliberalism or neoclassical economics, has a particular worldview, and it's that worldview that dominates policy formation. There are several other schools of economics with their own worldviews, but they don't have the influence, so it's almost like, what's the point in talking about them? It's the mainstream economics that kind of comes to the fore, and that's been the case for 250 years. And I've put, apart from a brief period when we had Keynesianism, which was the orthodoxy of the time, but pretty much that worldview has dominated our policy formation for 2.5 centuries. But before we get into the modern mainstream, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the classical economists and how they set the foundations for today's economists. So can you give us your view of these wonderful economists and their impact? And I'll kind of hit you off with Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus. I don't know if we need to go any further than those three, but how do they affect the way that we see the world, but more importantly, the way that modern economists see the world? And then maybe we'll start to connect that historical look at economics to the crisis we've got today.
Well, we turned them into kind of like mini gods, those three men, and then talk about their wonderful works. And they were all very extremely odd. I mean, when you look at their lives, they're extremely odd. But what they said fitted later with political projects. I think that's the key thing. They became a justification for behaving in certain ways. And now we have far-right think tanks called the Adam Smith Institute, which, if you want a clue that the way that some of Adam Smith's ideas might not have been brilliant, and some revelation on earth about how the world should work, the fact that we have extreme far-right think tanks named after the man is quite a good clue. Some of Ricardo's theory, the idea of comparative advantage, and that one country is going to make things. Well, the classic one, I think, was it Portal sherry from Portugal and wool from England. I always thought it really funny that the Chancellor still sits on the wool sack in the House of Commons. And in that sack is wool from sheep in every country of the British Empire. So the fact you can generate profitably wool everywhere kind of shows you that idea, very simplistic idea, really doesn't make sense. And then lastly, Malthus, the world's first salaried economist, who had bizarre fears of the French and the fact the French, he thought, were having too many children, and produced a theory that we were going to all starve if we didn't make sure that the feckless was somehow controlled. Well, in hindsight, this just proved to be wrong. I mean, and now we're facing rapid reductions in population, not some out of control. So these could all three, in a parallel universe, have been maverick, slightly odd men whose ideas never became popular. The reason they're popular is not because they're brilliant, not because they're apposite, not because the markets really work like some invisible hand, but because they provide a defense for saying, don't interfere, let people with money do what they want with their money, a defense of enormous private property held in just a few hands, and because a kind of religion was needed. If I'm going to annoy probably some listeners, it's almost like the opposite of Marxism. If you want somebody who really was clever, Karl Marx was very clever. But we have a kind of modern day religion of Marxism where Das Kapital is almost put forward as the Bible. Now, the equivalent from economists are these great founding fathers of economics. And the kind of thing you hear, I heard it this week on More or Less, was the discussion about inequality. And the economists that they'd invited, more or less as a Radio 4 program, to talk about inequality, had to get in the line, of course, something like, of course, we don't know whether inequality is a bad thing of itself. It's almost like a religious statement to show he was a true economist. The fact that inequality might be good. And that's one, because
that's a subjective judgment, and an economist doesn't make subjective judgments. We just tell you that it exists.
It exists, and also secretly, I suspect quite a lot of mainstream economists quite like inequality because they believe in wealth creators and they believe in huge differences between human beings. They talk about marriage markets, and they talk about some people being clever and more able, and they talk about human capital, and they talk about things that are actually quite nasty when you look at it.
That's a really good summary, but for me, it did kind of create this basis where, as you said, that it enabled people who already had wealth and power to maintain that wealth and power, and that certainly has given birth to the type of economics that we have now,
and to justify doing what they were doing and to feel good about it, and to justify the fact. So now, when we have these surveys that say that the biggest worry of people across the world is how to get by and not enough money, the mainstream economists will just say, well, that's the way the world is.
Yes, exactly.
Most people. Yeah. But unemployment, when you realise that this is the second biggest worry in the world, even in places where the rate is just 3 or 4%, and it's a huge worry of university students. Am I going to get a job? Let's go, oh, well, we just have to run a world like this. The most efficient way to fill jobs is where millions of you fill in hundreds of applications, and other people have to look through hundreds of applications and supposedly spot by their brilliance at sifting and then interviewing, somehow get the right person into the right
perfect person.
Yeah, because it's market competition, and that must be fair. And then you look at the outcome, who gets the jobs, and look at it by social class and by the colour of people's skin and by whether they're men or women, and go, it doesn't look very fair to me unless white men of upper classes are really, really able. And I should say, by the way, and I can say this because I'm a geographer, so we are very similar. In the US and the UK, economists tend to come from the most privileged social classes of all people with university degrees. Yes, and that's not unrelated.
I think that's a good position for us to start from, but to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page, what I want to do now, and this is just to save me and you speaking for an hour about and sketching this out, is I want the audience to be able to see or get an understanding of a kind of conceptual framework of what the mainstream looks like, because this is what you and I are going to talk about. So I'll leave this up on the screen for less than a minute. You can also download this to have a look through, but it shows how mainstream economics operates as a closed loop. Market-centered values form policy objectives. Policy is justified through abstract modeling, and success is measured by narrow indicators that reinforce, surprise, surprise, the original assumptions. Now, there's nothing new here for you, Danny, I suspect, but I hope this is useful for the audience to see, and it's a solid reference point when we talk about the mainstream. So if we've got this as our kind of founding position, the values, the primary goals that underlie the mainstream economics, let's take each of those 6 crises. How does this mainstream value, amplify, cause, justify the cost of living crisis?
It sees it as quietly necessary. It's because the system is the best that we have, and so if things increase in price, that is simply reflecting the fact that there's a growing scarcity. If there are many people who cannot afford the basics, such as heating and eating properly, well, they're not trying harder, and most cruelly, this is a great incentive for them to work harder. Not said like that nowadays. It used to be said, the classic phrase was that hunger is more effective than the overseer's whip. But it used to be said. So that's the first one of the cost of living.
It's also important to say that the economic system assumes that to invest, we grow the economy, and the only way that you can invest is to use people's savings. And who is it in society that saves? Well, it's not the poor. If you give them more money, they just spend it. You need to give more money to the wealthy so they save it, so you can turn it into investments so that you can grow the economy. And when you understand that framework, you can start to see why this isn't a problem for an economic system, because of the values that are at the heart of it.
Oh, and the well-off can also lend money to poorer people and have it returned with interest to become even richer, so that poor people can just get free the day, or even to get shelter to get a house. You have to be fairly well off now to get a mortgage, but a mortgage is just the right to borrow money for people who are better off even than you.
And we all struggle and challenge ourselves to be able to do that, don't we? I've got a quote here from your fellow Verso author, Stahl Horgerson, and he wrote a brilliant book a couple of years ago called Against the Crisis. And he said, when we focus only on how economic crises are created, capitalism appears brittle, fragile, and weak. But when we emphasize how they are resolved, it's difficult not to be overwhelmed by how flexible, viable, and adaptable capitalism is. The ruling class under capitalism, for example, seems able to accept everything from a welfare state, human rights, and better working conditions to poverty, genocide, and fascism in order to maintain its power. So when we're talking about cost of living, are we really talking about the cost of capitalism?
We're talking about what happens under capitalism. It's as capitalism has become most ubiquitous, at the point where its advocates cannot say it just needs a little bit more time and everything will be fine. It's been so long.
250 years is enough, isn't it?
It's kind of been long enough that when you get to this point, you can say that this really isn't an efficient means of distributing to people what they actually need. Similarly, with unemployment, the idea that you need people to fear this for things to work, it's really causing mental health to be very, very poor. As we measure that, we can see it getting worse around the world. The third great worry, violence. Capitalism supports huge investments in the defence and arms industry and weapons. This is one of the most profitable sectors, but that requires there to be violence and for there not to be peace. And then when the state does provide services, because it has to, because there is no way that the private sector ever actually houses most people well by itself. It certainly won't educate them by itself, and it absolutely doesn't provide healthcare that makes you healthy. So those are the main things that the state is involved in. And you get crises in those as there's pushes to try to reduce the size of this, and stories saying it's inefficient, it's ineffective. That's the fourth one. Climate is just an externality, almost like creative destruction. Well, let's see what happens when the planet warms up then, but we'll find a way through. There isn't
the ultimate.
There's no check and balance when it's all done at individual levels of firms, individual levels of countries. And then the biggest one, the biodiversity, the last one, as far as people are concerned, because it's not immediate, but irreversible changes to the planet. It's not there at all, as it's not measured, it's not costed.
Because it's incredibly difficult to do that under capitalism, because everything needs to have a financial value for it to be perceived as having an actual use value.
Yeah, but also at the same time, capitalism is encouraging greed. So it encourages people who are greedy and narcissistic to get more and behave in a more narcissistic, more greedy way. So our system of capitalism draws out the worst in us and rewards people who are the worst, the most willing to step on other shoulders or other people's necks to do things that others wouldn't to get more. The most brutal people rise up to the top. And you can now see their views, and we can listen to the billionaires tell us how they think the world works. So yeah, we've got to a point where people like me have been saying this for decades and decades. It's just a bit easier to say it now because we hardly have to draw out the evidence.
Yeah, exactly. People are seeing it in almost every medium and in every way possible now. Well, that's a good summary of your link to capitalism and crisis. But let's dig just a little bit deeper in a few of those areas before we finish. Let's go back to sharing the work. Looking at the way that we value work, that capitalism values work, the way that our economic framework does now, why do you think we're in a situation when so many people are worried about work, but also why so many people are unemployed? And then I want to finish that little bit of a chat by talking about a government job guarantee. I'll actually why are we unable to have full employment in this current macroeconomic framework that we've got?
There are different measures. So we need to be aware that the official measure of unemployment, the ILO one, doesn't actually tell you got to be available for work. So it doesn't include everybody who doesn't have paid work. Certainly doesn't include people who are caring. There's been a rise in the last 10, 15 years, particularly amongst young people who are not working, not looking after child, not in education, but also not seeking work. So not officially unemployed, but they're increasing. The wider fear is mainly held about people who've currently got jobs. And I think it's because other jobs so often involve a much lower wage, and they can be very low wage. So that fear is, even if you lose your job and get another job, and you're almost forced to get another job in some countries, the UK has some of the worst benefits for unemployment, your living standards will alter dramatically in ways you find hard to imagine. But it's this competition element, it's this precariousness. Competition is seen as good, and so everybody must seem able to perform. And only for a few people at the very top is there much great reward from this. And even they are not that certain about what's going to happen to them. Chief executive officers take an average income of about 4 million a year. And I think one reason they take that, apart from that they can take it, is that they only tend to stay in post for 2 or 3 years at most. So they grab that much money because a couple of years of an income of 4 million is enough to set yourself up quite nicely for life. But it also shows how concerned they are about money, that they've pushed those salaries at the top so incredibly high.
That's an interesting point.
And the amount people are paid does not reflect how useful they are, or what they're doing is actually making life better for other people. It's very hard to step back and say, how much should a job actually be paid? If it's a job which is dangerous and dirty, should it be paid more than others? If it requires working longer hours, should it be paid much more than others? The idea that you should pay people a lot because they've studied for many years, rather than help fill the shelves of supermarkets in those years, but they've been in a library learning. It's not a great sacrifice to be in a library learning. A lot of our thinking is usually warped.
So this is kind of, Polanyi's idea that you look at the labour and market, and it wouldn't be a market. There are parts of our economic process where you have to take them outside of this market and look at huge issues from the 1970s onwards with the removal of workers' rights and this idea that it is all about competition. And I think this is incredibly important for people to understand that in the 1970s, which you and I have spoken about before, about being quite a good time, you were in a safe, secure job that paid enough for you. If you were a man, for your wife not to work and your kids still went to a decent school and you had your own council house.
There are different models in different countries. So I've worked in universities my whole life where you get rewarded for moving between them in this period. But in other countries, people are actually rewarded for staying loyal to a university. Moving too often makes you look a bit shifty and selfish. Your salary tends to go up with time. It's going to come to your time. And I was once in Japan at a point where a university ran out of money. And their policy for running out of money was that everybody was not paid for a month, but they wouldn't think of sacking anybody, because it creates loyalty. But the UK and the USA are the kind of Wild West when it comes to employment. In many European countries, if you lose your job, the state pays you 80%, up to 80% of your salary for 2 years, because that's what you want a state for, is so that life can continue when things go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the support there to enable you to, retrain, find another job, or also do something completely different, which, you might find much more value. So my specific question then, because I was surprised to see unemployment so high in the surveys, considering I think there's a very strong policy of a government job guarantee. And this is a centrally funded, locally administered job. And we've spoken about this before when you came up to speak to me in Dundee. I know we've got slightly different views on this, but capitalism, as it's kind of defined, it's never going to be able to deliver full employment. The only time that got close was post-World War II, when the state effectively came in and gave everyone a job, either directly or spent so much money that it boosted the economy to be able to provide private jobs. But it's not the job of the private sector to give everyone a job. And I think when people understand that, you start to see a government job guarantee differently. So I'll ask you directly then. I mean, I know you know a little bit about the government job guarantee, but if the state funds useful, locally delivered jobs for everyone, wouldn't this get rid of this horrible fear that so many people have about being unemployed?
Could certainly help. It's just I'm at the age to remember the youth training scheme. And the problem with the YTS, brought in by the Tories in the 80s, was that it was compulsory. And if it's compulsory, it can end up being you're doing very low value work, where also it verges on slavery if you're forced to work.
100%.
So my caveat is just always make it voluntary, so people don't have to take up the offer so they can be their own judge of whether this is what they're doing is useful. People will really choose to work. And the other is realizing that we do not need everybody in paid employment anymore, because the factories have closed down. The fields now have combine harvesters in them. We can't all possibly be bike mechanics for each other's bicycles. Some of us manage to fix them ourselves, right? That the idea that we need everybody to be in a paid job, idea that this shouldn't be the aim. If people want to do things like try to create that band that they think is going to work one day, or write poems or do something else, we can generate enough food and enough goods that we don't need everybody working. But to say that is seen as, that would be terrible. That would be terrible. We would have freeloaders.
I think it's really important to say that, it's we die by false analogies, don't we? And the job guarantee is not the YTS scheme, because it's voluntary. It's 100% voluntary. So that kind of ticks that first issue. And then the second one is that if a local community wants to employ 10 poets to write poems, then it creates those jobs and it gives them to poets. It's for local community to decide the value.
The job guarantee being brought into certain areas of England may not be voluntary. I don't think it's been decided. It's been announced that it'll happen, and it's going to be in some parts of the country. But that we also have some European countries bringing in conscription. This isn't voluntary. So you've got to be careful about. You've got quite a fragile young population who are more worried than their parents and grandparents about the future. Half of them go to university, and we've given them the biggest debts in the world. Actually, slightly bigger than the debts in the US. I just think it's worth being really, really careful to the best way to make it clear this is good is you will be offered the job, but you don't have to take it, and we'll try to make it so that you want to take it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's fundamentally the job guarantee, not the workfare programs that as you alluded to. Well, next one I wanted to touch on, we covered it a little bit, but a little bit more in depth, this idea of war and a home. Again, how does the economic system that we've got lead us, possibly, I could say this, towards militarization and war?
I mean, at the moment, it's really easy argument to make, because all these European countries are promising to spend 5% of their GDP on arms. It's become much easier to say that this is what's happening. I suspect quite a lot of those countries will try to include things that are not weapons under that 5%. And we're talking on in late January, just at the point when Donald Trump has reached a new peak of. I watched a news clip just before we came on about whether European countries are going to have to go to the UN to try to control the United States. So the idea that we may stick to that 5% promise on buying arms, mainly buying arms from United States weapons companies, may not be there. But a pure classical economic thinking is this is just another good. That the role of the state should be mainly protection. So ideally, everything, water, gas, electricity, your schools get privatized, as in effect they have been in England, their academies. Your health service is privatized. You don't want state housing. The state simply has a monopoly on violence. And then private companies can make money out of supplying the state with weapons. But it's quite hard to defend that if you don't have wars. To say that we need to keep
wasteful expenditure.
How many fighter jets do you want to buy more every year? Where are you going to park them all? You actually need them to be used and to blow up so that you can sell more. The fact that we can't step back and there's a story recently about Barrow and a very poor area of England, Barrow-in-Furness, talking about how wonderful it would be if a $10 billion nuclear submarine could be built there, because this would create jobs, with no irony about what a $10 billion nuclear weapon submarine is or what its purpose is for.
Yep. Back to the full employment point, because Warren Moser said to me when I met him a few months ago, he said, you've got to think about jobs as a cost. right? And he often does this. He says things that I just can't conceptualize what he's talking about, and it takes me a minute to do it. And he was just using that example. He said, if you've got a full employment program and you've got loads of people doing wonderful jobs that are beneficial, if someone comes to you and says, can you build a nuclear submarine and there's 10,000 jobs? And you just say, well, we don't need 10,000 jobs. That's a cost. We don't need the jobs. We're doing something kind of meaningful. And I thought it was a really interesting way of looking at the kind of the real harms that we do because we need the jobs.
People don't have to do things that they don't want to do when they have the freedom of actually a choice to do something better.
Yeah.
But that doesn't occur organically by greedy people creating freedom to do good things. It's not
I wanted to also just to kind of mention Thorsten Bevlin. He's probably my favourite economist, but he's got some really interesting thoughts I read recently, and I think it's really interesting considering what's going on. But he looked at England and Germany and the kind of institutional responses in the 1880s to the Second Industrial Revolution, which he called the mass consumer capitalism. This idea that there's excess goods. And he said in England, they just shipped all of their excess goods off to their empire because it was a fairly small country, and that got rid of it. And that allowed capitalists to keep making all of this profit. Germany didn't have an empire, wasn't a particularly big country. It had all this excess, and they thought, well, let's just spend loads of that, or use all of resources on war and militarism. And he also said, but America had all these people flooding into the country, so there was no excess goods. So they never really needed an empire. They never really needed to go to war. And I think that's a wonderful lens to look at. But obviously it's changed since Veblen was looking at it. And if we look at like the 1960s, America had two choices with its excess goods. It goes to war, or it redistributes them to all of the people in America and provides all the goods and services that any normal society would do to make it much more equal. And the institutions and the establishment and the people in power are choosing this militarism, imperialism 2.0, rather than giving those resources to everyone in America. That's kind of how I see it. But would you agree with that, or see any different in how things have progressed over that kind of period, 100 years, and where America is now, and also Europe to a lesser extent?
I mean, one reason why Britain, after 1945, the government created full employment and so on, was that men were coming back with guns from a war. And, if you were going to tell them we're going to go back to the late 1930s again, it might have been bad news. So people in charge of us can be remarkably magnanimous when they are scared about what might happen. The US was also making a lot of money out of the rest of the world in the 60s, not least because the rest of the world was growing in population. It was growing at the peak at 2% a year, huge increase in population in the 60s. So if you've got a good, say, a sticky liquid called Coca-Cola, and you're selling that good, and you have rising numbers of young people in the rest of the world, and you send out fridges with Coke written on it, and this is sold as a luxury good, you can do well. But you can't carry on doing that well when the rest of the world stops having children at that rate. So the US, it had relative full employment in the 60s, and it was relatively equal despite building up its arms at the time. It then became dramatically less equal in the 70s, and usually in the 80s under Reagan. And the maximum number of nuclear missiles was in the 80s under Reagan as well at the same time. So it attacked its poor and it built up its arms. Thankfully, even Reagan's advisors realized that mutually assured destruction might well be used. So even under Reagan, even under the Republicans, there was a disarmament that occurred that had nothing to do with capitalism. It was just a moment of sanity, of you cannot carry on arming yourself to the teeth with multiple intercontinental ballistic missiles. But before we got to that point, a lot of money was made at getting us onto the edge of Armageddon.
The last thing I want to kind of look at is this idea of cradle to grave. So I think we just touched on it, but again, can you look at the crisis or the issues that people have as they consider, they're being born in a good hospital right through to getting a good pension at the end?
It just shows up again and again. These are everyday concerns, and some of them are extremely serious. So the biggest ones are about healthcare. It is, how am I going to die? Am I going to die in pain? Will I be treated? What was interesting to me was that in China, even though China is very economically unequal, inequality wasn't a major concern because Chinese people tend to be much better off than their parents or grandparents were. Poverty is generally not a concern, even though it's high in rural areas. Unemployment is not a concern because there are job guarantees. War and violence tends to be not a concern because the level of violence is very low, and China doesn't tend to get involved in wars, at least not directly. So healthcare came out top. And that's partly having an elderly population and a growing elderly population, and not being sure that the system is certainly not available for free. And that's a real everyday worry. And your worries change, of course, by age.
Yeah.
Once you get, I'm in my late 50s, right? Health is something that, you noticed around you much more and more and more. And that is a concern. But it's also large for worrying about education and worrying about the future. And what is it that we're providing, and how unfair is it? And the other big one is housing. And to what extent is the state going to make sure that rents are controlled, which happens in many countries? What extent does the state build and maintain housing for people? It's far harder for the private sector to get people to pay a fortune for really shoddy housing if there's a decent state sector there. So I'm not pessimistic in this book. I think there are lots of examples in the world about where we are moving in positive directions. And in general, government spending over, since we began to measure it seriously, since the 60s, almost everywhere has been quietly rising and rising and rising. It's much lower in Britain and in other European countries, but it still tends to go between a minimum of 35% of GDP and a maximum of 52, 54% of GDP, levels that could never have been imagined by economists in the 1960s.
Absolutely.
And it's an aging society, and also a society which isn't willing to tolerate things that we did actually tolerate in the far more equitable 60s and 70s. If a family needs to be rehoused now and they got children, we don't have them walking around the streets with a pram anymore. So some things do get better, but they're getting better in a way which is moving us away from all those purist economic ideas. And we're slowly, painfully, gradually getting our way on this. We have fewer wars now than we had in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the world. We have rising wars, but few of them. Far fewer people are dying in those wars than were in the past. So I don't go into great deal on this in the book, because it's a book about crises.
Fairly optimistic, especially towards the end. I mean, you say things like the climate crisis is terrible and it's causing lots of deaths. But if you look at extreme weather events, less people are dying because, if you think of a tsunami, for example, countries have implemented early warning systems. So these things are still happening. Maybe even they're happening at an increasing rate, but we're adapting in some way to kind of stop some of these things happening. So there's definitely I was a bit more... I was surprised that you were as positive at the end of this book.
Yeah, I am. Lots of good things happen. They tend to happen quietly and under the surface, like producing better warming systems for tsunamis, better systems for floods and so on. Most people are good. They quietly work. Those with little bits of power quietly work to try to make things better in their particular fields of expertise. Way about forest fires, we have a better idea about how to deal with them than we did. So it's just that in the noisy world of politics and the news and the people who are the official advisors to government, we've kind of concentrated the bad ideas at the very top. And you can look for the good. The classic would be, if people doubt me, incredible drops in infant mortality, incredible improvements in health. Parents are now the least likely in world history to experience a child die. And most of that is hard work by millions of people and some international collaboration with the WHO. And there were big changes. I only read today the stories of how Trump's now trying to get all the US funding out of the World Health Organization, funds about 15% of it. When Trump first did this in his first period as president, China promised to replace all the funding that Trump took out. Now, we don't know if they're going to do that again, but there are big shifts going around in the world. And there's only a minority of countries that really believe in neoclassical economics. It's if you look at the UN board on voting, in Europe, it's really Britain is the flag waver for this. In the Americas, it's the US and the home of the Chicago boys. But it's just a few places on Earth where you and I happen to live in one of them, sadly. But it's a few places on Earth which are still going, this is the way to go. The rest of the world, I think, is looking at it, looking at the economic state of Britain. There was the Institute of Fiscal Studies did a newscast this morning in which one economist was explaining that the differences inside England were as big as the differences between countries, and the north of England was getting the investment of Romania to the south. Now, there's the Institute of Fiscal Studies broadcasting this live and this morning. So I'm optimistic because I spot these things, but I'm not optimistic in that it doesn't just happen without a lot of work, and the ratio is unfair. It's thousands of good little acts versus just a few people who manage to get on the news and tell us how the economy should work, who are going against.
Okay, well, I'm just going to give one kind of counter to that because it was something I spotted yesterday, and this is a narrative, and it's not new, but I'm aware of it kind of increasingly coming into the mainstream discourse, I think, and this is the idea that someone is getting something that you deserve. Right. And this othering, it's always been part of the kind of mainstream or neoclassical idea. But I've got an example from my friend and yours, Fraser Nelson. And he posted this yesterday, right? He said, people aged 65 to 74 have 5 times the wealth of those aged between 25 and 34. So why do shop workers and cleaners pay full fare for public transport, he's talking about, while pensioners ride for free? And I think this is just a great example of people in the establishment saying, based on this neoliberal framework we've got, the government can't afford to give everyone free bus fare. It'd just be impossible. So that person, that old guy sitting on the bus, he's sitting in your seat for free.
You turn it around and say, you shouldn't, it's not that fun getting a bus pass and suddenly realizing how old you are. What we need is bus passes. We need bus passes for everybody, so it's not a sudden, shock.
Absolutely,
I'm that age.
Yeah, but Fraser Nelson is not suggesting. At the end of that, he didn't say why not give bus passes from everyone, because he assumes that the government can't afford to give everyone bus passes. He's saying stop it.
But we can afford the kind of education system in Britain that doesn't exist in the West, and is incredibly expensive. Fraser, I think, went to the Dollar Academy in Scotland. It's incredibly inefficient having elite private schools. They cost an absolute fortune. I'm sure Fraser has the natural ability within himself. If he'd just gone to a normal comprehensive, he'd have been fine. So there's a way of, if you want to save the money, there are lots of ways we could do it. But the money is concentrated amongst the very richest. They're the ones flying private jets. That's really expensive. Other countries have cut down on allowing how many private jet flights there can be. Right, so more people in buses not having to pay a fare. Buses are not so exciting that you go out and go, oh, what am I going to do today? I'm going to sit in a bus all day. And there are people who sit in a bus all day, but poor sods, they're sitting in a bus all day because they're too cold at home.
Exactly. It's not people who have got 5 times the wealth of your average 25-year-old who are sitting on the bus. Just thought it was an interesting example of how this narrative is still linked to this Malthusian idea that there's too many people and we can't provide all of the services because the government's only got so much money, and we know it has to be in the hands of different people. So I know it's 250 years between those two instances, Malthus and Fraser Nelson's tweet yesterday, but for me, there's a definite connection of a kind of ideology is the mainstream, and we've really got to react against that.
You could just slam it down by looking at what the individual's saying that other people have got too much. what is their house like? What is their background? What have they had over the course? How much money has been spent on them? And it's almost always people who are incredibly privileged telling the rest that they've got to rebalance between themselves, but don't look at me and my family. And just puncture it like that.
Hopefully we've been able to give our viewers and our listeners some idea of the impact of this framework, and that there is an alternative, isn't there, Danny? Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me. Cheers then.
If you're enjoying this episode of the SCOTONOMICS podcast, please consider joining us on Patreon with a paid subscription for as little as £3 per month. Your support will ensure we can continue to create this podcast. Find the link in the show notes or head over to patreon.com/SCOTONOMICS. Also, please do like, share and comment on this podcast.